Hi everybody, and welcome back to the second part of our video reviewing information from chapters 1 and 2. So at the end of the video for part 1, we talked about least restrictive environment, and this is from the chapter PowerPoint, chapter 1 PowerPoint that's on Blackboard. So if you look at slide 7, which hopefully we got, it gives you a more detailed explanation, starting with the least restrictive environment and headed to the most restrictive environment. So there's two different ways for you to kind of think about how those environments look. And the key to least restrictive environment is always remembering that it's student specific based on individual learning needs. It's not diagnosis specific, meaning that we walk into a meeting and saying, oh, John has autism. Well, we've got a self-contained classroom for kids with autism. That's where he goes. Instead, it means we sit down and look at John and say, hey, John, based on your learning needs, based on what helps you learn and what challenges you're learning, it looks like your least restrictive environment would be. And then we walk through that. But it's always based on student data and student information, not on what a child is diagnosed with, what the needs of the district are. It's always based on a student's individual learning needs. And that's set up under IDEA. So it kind of rounds back to our initial discussion. I'm going to scroll down a little bit further within the PowerPoint for Chapter 1 and look at slide 13. The other terms we've talked about a little bit in class, IDEA, IEPs, we will talk about in greater detail later. But we haven't talked a lot about the differences between inclusion and mainstreaming. We did talk about labeling a little bit in our small groups at the very end of class on Thursday, and we'll continue to talk about what are the advantages and disadvantages of labeling, especially as it pertains to how a student is perceived by other teachers, by other students, by themselves, and in the community. But the book does a fantastic job of laying out some of the basic arguments. So if you kind of have forgotten that, you'll want to review that before we get to the first test in a few months. When we're looking at the differences between inclusion and mainstreaming, those terms are often used interchangeably, but they mean very different things, and so I want you to be clear on the differences for that. So to make that even clear, I'm going to show you some illustrations here that hopefully will help. So the first illustration, this blue one, talks about mainstreaming as a student with a disability who is moved into the gen ed classroom, which is represented here by these 4 stick children in a box. And mainstreaming means that a student with a disability occasionally gets to spend time in a gen ed classroom. The inclusion model, and the term inclusion, is a very different, exact opposite of mainstreaming, where mainstreaming, student with a disability is outside the classroom and is allowed in sometimes. And note the word allowed in. That's the key phrase there. The student has to earn their way into the gen ed classroom by good behavior, by understanding academics, by demonstrating an ability to master content or to follow social and teacher cues. Those are things that we would say in mainstreaming. The student is able to do all these things, so we'll let them in the gen ed classroom for a little while. Inclusion is the opposite. Inclusion says we're going to build in supports and accommodations, modifications that are needed so a student can be part of this classroom at all times, or as much of the time as their least restrictive environment calls for. But inclusion says I'm already a part. I'm going to get the help I need, and if the help I need also means a quiet environment for part of my day, then that's part of my inclusion strategy. But inclusion is all about I'm here in the beginning, and mainstreaming is about I'm out here and I'm going to be allowed in sometimes. So inclusion, I'm in; mainstreaming, I'm out, and sometimes you get to knock on the door to get in. This was how it was first explained to me, and I think this image has always helped me understand it. If we think of gen ed as a nice little house where all the kids live together, and in the early days of special education, you'll remember that kids were not part of the gen ed environment, were not part of the school environment. So kind of think of that special ed environment as being out of the building, in a shed, in a sub-building. My dad taught in one of the first special education classrooms right after IDEA, and his classroom was literally next to the boiler room. So when teachers joke about that, oh yeah, we used to put kids with disabilities next to the boiler room, that was really where their classes were. Whatever odd leftover space was there. So they were not part of the main environment. And so think about, the students with disabilities were over here in this shed in some sub classroom, and they had to earn their way into this classroom by good grades, good behavior, right? Okay, where inclusion says, I'm here in this classroom and sometimes I'm going to go and be taught, hopefully not anywhere near a subpar classroom. Hopefully it's in an equal environment, an equal classroom with equal stuff. But sometimes I'm going to go out and do other things, but my main home is in the gen ed classroom. Mainstreaming my house is out of the classroom. My regular home is not the home of gen ed, it's some other home, and I'm sometimes allowed in. So it's that whole concept of least dangerous assumption. Do I have space and a voice and ownership within that gen ed classroom? That's our least dangerous assumption. So when you're thinking about inclusion versus mainstreaming, know that the terminology that we're going to use is inclusion, not mainstreaming. And when people use that alternate term mainstreaming, you might want to give them that little lesson of history and kind of use either one of these picture representations to help them understand the difference, and that we want kids to be included, not mainstreamed. So we've talked about Chapter 1, and we'll continue to talk about Chapter 1, but we're going to look for a second at a few key parts of Chapter 3. Sorry, wrong chapter. Chapter 2. And we're going to continue to talk about Chapters 1, 2, and 3 pretty interchangeably over the next few weeks because they just really weave together. When we look at Chapter 2 and look at some of those common characteristics of kids with mild disability, we already looked at the diagrams that showed us that most kids with disabilities fall under that mild category. And I think we talked about a little bit in class that while those labels can help us understand some basic characteristics of kids with a disability category like the student that we are working with, know that there are very similar instructional strategies that are effective across multiple groups of students. So something that might help a student with ADHD focus and attend in class, like response cards, would be equally helpful for a student with autism and equally helpful for a student with a specific learning disability or some language processing disability. So often we look at those best practices and evidence-based practices as helping multiple students. When you are in Blackboard and you look at the Marzano instructional strategies that I believe are either in week 2 or week 3 and 4 resources, those best practices support most of the students with whom you will work. Know that a lot of students with a mild disability, like a specific learning disability, might really need a lot of supports in school, but might be perfectly fine outside of school and not require the additional supports that they need to be successful in school. Things like readers and scribes. A lot of adults that still would be considered to have reading and writing skills that are below the general population usually have coping strategies that they use to help them deal with large amounts of text or to deal with large writing, and they find ways in careers that support and help them to be successful. We're going to talk about in Chapter 3 that concept of 6-hour disabilities, and that definitely comes into play in Chapter 2, especially when we're looking at how poverty, abuse, and neglect affect students. That's why the Ruby Payne readings are in week 2, and that's why we're going to start looking at them and talking about them in discussion board, and we really will talk about this woven throughout every class from here on out. We know that there is a much larger number of students who are in minority populations within special education, and sometimes we'll see that those disabilities run through families. So we really want to be careful as special educators that we're not creating a population of kids that have learned helplessness, that perceive themselves as having disabilities simply because there was an overrepresentation of students, especially students with emotional and behavioral disabilities, where because they acted out in kindergarten, received a diagnosis of emotional disability, and stayed in a self-contained classroom until they dropped out of high school. We want to avoid that happening and make sure we provide kids with the supports they need, understanding those hidden rules of school that we'll be talking about, and make sure kids know what they need to do to succeed. Some of you have already looked at Piaget. If you haven't, page 97, if you want to take a look at that Piaget's theory and make sure you kind of understand the different ways in which we grow and learn to think, and understand that there are pockets within kids with disabilities where they might really struggle with a specific skill. So for example, if a student is not able to create mental imagery that usually is mastered in stage 2, what can we use to help students? So something that I did with kids that really had trouble figuring in mental pictures, we would stop and do that together. If I wanted to create an image that would help me remember this, what could I do? And I would talk it through. Let me think about things I know how to draw, things I know I could find on Google. I could find an image of a house and a shed, and that would really help me understand the difference between mainstreaming and inclusion. Yeah, I'll draw that image and maybe some arrows going back and forth. That would help me understand. By talking through my reasoning, it helps kids develop those self-talk skills and that awareness of, okay, I don't have a picture in my head of what this looks like, so I need to find a picture that helps me understand. So that's one of the key things that we'll be doing within the world of special education services, is looking at how kids grow and learn and then helping them to fill in the gaps where they are struggling. In class, we might not always know the why a kid has a disability. We won't always know whether there is good nutrition in the home or not, whether there's been some kind of trauma, whether they have a genetic factor that has not yet been identified. But we can always figure out the how. What strategies are going to be effective to support learning? The how is what we need to worry about most, more than the why. And something I always want us to keep in mind: if we've met one child with a diagnosis, I've met exactly one child. Every kid might have some similar traits that we need to support, but I need to be really careful, and you need to be careful when we're working with kids not to assume, well, just because you have a diagnosis of autism, that means that's how you function. And just because you have a diagnosis of an emotional disability doesn't mean that that's necessarily an accurate and true reflection of who you are as a learner and who you're going to be as an adult. So we need to support and make sure, just like this kid who really did have ants in his pants and just needed help, didn't need a whole litany of supports for attention deficit disorder, he just needed new pants and some ant spray. Make sure that we're providing the appropriate supports at the appropriate times. We are going to talk in class about the differences between kids with intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, and learning disabilities. And for me, there are some great charts in the book, but I have trouble keeping up with all that information. A visual supports my learning better, so I made 2 visuals that would help me remember. When I'm looking at an IQ score, or how a student is expected to perform, know that there's some very clear differences based on this chart. Kids with an intellectual disability are going to overall struggle academically and with their social skills, their adaptive skills, how they succeed and move through the school. Whereas kids with emotional disabilities or behavioral disabilities, they're going to be in that average, low average with their IQ and their academics. They're still going to struggle, probably as a general profile, and their adaptive skills are probably also going to be right in that low average, especially if you consider that an adaptive skill is the ability to handle stress in school and handle conflict. A lot of times those are struggles for kids with emotional disabilities. If we look at kids with learning disabilities, their profile is going to be very different, because we're going to see an IQ that's average or above average, and adaptive skills, how they cope in school, as being high. But their academic skills, either in some areas like language arts or math, are going to be lower, closer to what we would expect for a student with an intellectual disability or an emotional disability. So hopefully looking at graphs like this and developing these for yourself will help you understand A, how to support kids with disabilities in class, but B, how to remember the key differences between intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, and learning disabilities. This will come up on the exam 1, so you want to make sure you really understand what the basic profile of a student with these 3 categories would look like. If we look at the next chart, if we want to add some picture supports, know that overall, socially, you're going to look at a student with intellectual disabilities and expect they might be immature, maybe still playing with baby dolls in the 6th grade. Where a kid with an emotional disability might really have that fighting attitude or be very shy, and a student with a learning disability might be very withdrawn and have poor self-esteem because they understand that they're struggling in a subject that their friends are not. So this has given us a kind of happy overview, hopefully, of the beginnings of Chapter 2. We'll continue to work on activities in class. I'll look forward to seeing you Thursday. Keep an eye out for announcements so you'll know if we're going to be at Northside or at Ball State. And if you've got any questions today, please shoot me a Blackboard IM, a Skype message, or a text. Talk to you later.